Hello, I'm James Crossley and welcome to one of a series of 10 special podcasts celebrating 10 years of the Centre for the Critical Study of Apocalyptic and Millenarian Movements here at the University of Cambridge, but founded way back in 2015 with the support of the Panacea Charitable Trust. What we'll do in these podcasts is look at things apocalyptic and millenarian from different angles. We hope you enjoy them. Today we'll look at the religious thinking behind the English Uprising of 1381, otherwise known, slightly misleadingly, as the Peasants Revolt, when parts of England turned against aristocrats and archbishops, destroying property, monasteries, and even parts of London. The summer of 1381 saw unprecedented violent uprisings from peasants, serfs, artisans, village elites, townsfolk, local officials, lower clergy and others, against the lords, landowners, ecclesiastical leaders and royal advisers. And, naturally, there were local grudges and vendettas thrown into the mix. In the southeast, the most famous leader was Wat Tyler. But here and elsewhere the lower clergy played an important role in the revolt, not least in offering theological justifications, though they too were prepared to join in with the violence, of course. In his famous and controversial book, The Pursuit of the Millennium from 1957, Norman Cohen decorated his discussion of the ideas underpinning the uprising with phrases like a fantasy of an impending miraculous restoration of an egalitarian state of nature aligned with ideas of the mystical anarchism of the free spirit. This was typical Cohen flamboyance, but there was apocalyptic and millenarian thinking running through the English Uprising. Before we get to that, a quick note on context. It's regularly pointed out that the 1381 uprising was one involving unambiguous economic and class resentments and social aspirations. The decades following the Black Death of 1348-1349 saw significant social and economic upheaval. With nearly half the population of Europe wiped out, labourers could take advantage of the labour shortage and different opportunities. In one response from above, Parliament tried to cap wages, restrict mobility and keep serfs tied to the land, and this in turn generated resentment and further tensions. The ongoing costly wars with France and the taxes required to fund them fueled tensions, particularly as there was not always sufficient protection for the communities vulnerable to coastal raids. 3 new taxes introduced between 1377 and 1380 only intensified the problems, most famously the coercive techniques involved in the 1380 poll tax. This was the spark for the revolts associated with Wat Tyler in the southeast of England. On Thursday the 13th of June 1381, the feast of Corpus Christi, rebels from the southeast arrived in London and swelled their ranks with Londoners and prisoners sprung from jail. Though there were exceptions, it seems that the rebels were generally disciplined and deliberately selected political, economic, legal and ecclesiastical targets, most famous of which was the Savoy Palace belonging to John of Gaunt. The rebels even managed to negotiate with the king, Richard II, and made demands such as the end of serfdom, the pardon of criminals, and the removal or execution of royal advisers. Some rebels even got into the Tower of London and decapitated leading figures of the realm, including the Archbishop of Canterbury and Chancellor of England, Simon Sudbury. King Richard had accepted some key rebel demands, but Tyler and the Kentish rebels pushed further still, including for a radical reshaping of the legal system, aristocracy, and church, which would be overseen by the king and one bishop. In the confusion that followed a meeting between Wat Tyler and the king, Tyler was fatally wounded, and Richard was able to pacify the rebels and begin the process of restoring aristocratic order to England. The most famous priest of the revolt was John Ball. There is not much known about the details of Ball's life prior to 1381, or when and where he was even born. It seems he was a priest connected to St Mary's York, typically thought to be St Mary's Abbey or an associate church, who later moved or returned to Colchester. After his move to Essex, we have clear evidence for some of his notorious activities as an itinerant lower clergyman. In February 1364, Edward III had allowed Ball special protection after Ball feared physical harm from his enemies. But the king revoked such protection upon learning that Ball wandered from place to place, preaching articles contrary to the faith of the church, to the peril of his soul and the souls of others, especially of laymen. Ball was known for his popular preaching in or around public markets, cemeteries, streets and fields, and it seemed to involve challenging the lords and their power. Ball's provocative preaching meant that he was in regular trouble with church authorities, and as early as October 1364, Sudbury, then Bishop of London, excommunicated Ball for his ongoing activities. In December 1376, further reference was made to Ball's excommunication under Sudbury, now Archbishop of Canterbury. In April 1381, just weeks before the uprising, Sudbury implied that Ball was among the false prophets. Sudbury denounced his ideas as heretical and poisonous, claiming that his views went against apostolic and church authority, and noting his elusiveness by comparing him to a fox evading a hunter. This assessment may reflect something of the local and popular support Ball had. By the time of the 1381 uprisings, we learn more about the details of Ball's teaching. Echoing passages in the Gospels denouncing the rich, Ball criticised social, economic, political and religious order. He lashed out at lords in fine clothing, dwelling in luxurious houses, and consuming good food and drink. By contrast, the lower orders were in poor cloth, living off chaff and water, and working in the fields, through wind and rain, all for the benefit of the lords, helping them to keep and maintain their estates. Ball was said to have wanted a dramatic restructuring of the church in England, which involved getting rid of the lords, archbishops, bishops, abbots and priors, as well as most of the monks and canons, so that there should be no bishop in England except one archbishop, namely himself, as one account put it. Ball was said to be active not only in the southeast, but around and in London during the revolt. And here we have a bit of a historical problem. And the problem is accounts of him being sprung from prison by rebels just before the uprising started and delivering a sermon at Blackheath on the 12th of June. We have an account of Ball released from an unspecified prison. We have an account of Ball being released from Maidstone prison. So far, no problem, assuming that the information is generally accurate, of course. However, over 40 years ago, Andrew Prescott found a reference to someone referred to as John Ball, the traitor, being freed from prison in Bishop's Stortford on the 11th of June. And if this is the John Ball, then it contradicts the usual story. Now, it's difficult to know what precisely happened. Even so, we shouldn't despair too much, as we have a degree of consistency in how Ball is presented across sources. So we must understand that when we talk about the words of Ball, we are talking in general terms, rather than a precise word-for-word account. And that's not too bad. Ball was said to have used the story of Adam and Eve and the beginning of human history in order to criticise the present and anticipate and provoke an imminent replacement of the social and political order. Ball's most famous saying, though there were similar sayings around at the time, opened the sermon apparently given at Blackheath. When Adam dug and Eve span, who was then a gentleman? In other words, Adam and Eve, according to the book of Genesis, were active when there was no serfdom, and so serfdom had to be a later invention to justify the power of the lords. For Ball, a popular hierarchy would be put in place in order to dispense justice where the lords had failed. To do this, Ball advocated a violent overthrow of much of the existing hierarchy, as he put it in this report of Ball's sermon.
He therefore urged them to be men of courage, and out of love for their virtuous fathers who had tilled their land and pulled up and cut down the noxious weeds which usually choke the crops, to make haste themselves at that present time to do the same. They must do this first by killing the most powerful lords of the realm, then by slaying the lawyers, justiciars, and jurors of the land, and finally by weeding out from their land any that they knew would in the future be harmful to the Commonwealth. Thus they would in the end gain peace for themselves and security for the future, if after removing the magnates there was equal freedom between them, and they each enjoyed the same nobility, equal dignity, and similar power.
For those who seek biblical allusions, the noxious weeds is a reference to the parable of the wheat and the tares in Matthew 13. The parable in Matthew's Gospel talks about an enemy sowing weeds among the good seed and sorting and destroying the good weeds from the bad. The explanation in the Gospel is that the Son of Man sows the good seed, and the good seed represents the children of the kingdom. Similarly, the devil sows the bad, and the weeds are the children of the devil. Fittingly, the parable has an eschatological conclusion whereby the harvesting is the end of age, and the angels will remove causes of sin and the evildoers. Ball's application of this parable to justify the violent transformation of England is clear enough. The parable of the wheat and the tares was used to describe heresy in medieval England. It was even used against Ball himself. But Ball was now turning the parable against the church hierarchy and against the lords. Their exploitation, he claimed, was the real heresy. But not all the existing hierarchy would be removed in Ball's understanding of the future. The king was ultimately assumed to have the common people's interests at heart. The blame in the revolt is on the king's advisors, who were seen as corrupt, exploitative, self-serving, and manipulating the king. The myth of the ideal and just king was an old tradition which gained some authority from the Bible. Additionally, medieval eschatological thought inherited popular prophecies about a final Christian emperor who would deal with enemies and bring justice and prosperity. Or again, William Langland's roughly contemporary vision poem Piers Plowman had an often unintentional influence on the rebels, and it includes a discussion of the idea of a Christian king who would bring peace and justice, with echoes of King David in the Bible. Thinking about an idealised new order may explain the timing of the rebels' arrival in London on the Feast of Corpus Christi, Thursday the 13th of June. This feast was the celebration of the Eucharist and the body of Christ, which in turn had implications for understanding the cohesion, or otherwise, of the social body. As Margaret Aston showed, such celebrations would have involved ideas about liberation and the biblical stories about the exodus from Egypt under Pharaoh, which were understood to foreshadow the crucifixion and Christian freedom for all. While we might speculate about what Ball could have said in a Corpus Christi sermon, or how ideas of sacrifice, community and freedom may have chimed with the material and ideological interests of the rebels, such Eucharistic ideas seem to be present in a cryptic letter attributed to Ball, which combined ideas of bread making and Christ's death. We learn that John Miller, probably a coded or generic name for someone who worked with bread, has ground small, 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 the King of Heaven's Son shall ransom all. A similar combination of the labour in bread making and salvation is found in a letter attributed to Jack Miller, which was possibly written by Ball using a generic pseudonym. As Aston further showed, the language of bread of life, grain, flour, grinding and milling in relation to Christ and salvation would have been known from sermons, matins, poems and plays relating to Corpus Christi. The Eucharistic understandings from below in the letters associated with Ball may reveal an alternative, united social body through reference to everyday labour, much like Ball's understanding of Adam and Eve and their respective work. Adam digging, Eve spinning. The letters associated with Ball are a call to arms. There is, for instance, a cryptic greeting accompanied by a claim about Ball ringing a bell, which may be a reference to church bells signalling that the moment had arrived for the rebels to act. The letters also claim that now is time, including the time to stand together in truth, and that truth will help the rebels' cause. These references to time and truth have close connections with the eschatological language used in John's Gospel, further supporting the claim that the cryptic message was one about the appointed time for dramatic social transformation. There is a less cryptic reference to the apocalyptic moment in Ball's sermon at Blackheath, or at least in the presentation of it. Ball was said to have proclaimed that God had now given them the time during which they could put off the yoke of their long servitude, and that, if they wished, rejoice in the liberty they had long desired. As all this indicates, there was not a strong emphasis on an expected divine intervention in history, if any at all. Instead, the emphasis was more on how human history and organisation could implement the divine plan. A curious sentiment attributed to Ball in a summary of his preaching goes like this: "No one was fit for the kingdom of God who had not been born in wedlock." There may be some moral conservatism to this, including an attack on misbehaving priests and bishops and their troublesome children. The context is all about a certain kind of anti-clericalism in the teaching of Ball. We also know from Piers Plowman and the Lollard Richard Wick, for instance, that chaos and disorder were linked to bastardy, troublesome parents, and those improperly conceived, including those being born out of wedlock. Comparisons were made with biblical figures such as Cain and his sinful line and its influence, which continued to the present, not least with unsavoury bishops and priests. Ball looked to a future of communally shared possessions and distribution according to need, probably based on the example of the early church as described in Acts of the Apostles chapters 2 and 4. He was said to have preached that things were not well to pass in England, nor do till everything be in common. This would be a time when there would be no serfdom, no greater lords, and no exploitation of peasant labour, because all come from one father and mother, Adam and Eve. Debates about the meaning of all things in common were well established by 1381, and for Ball, this hope for a new England was most obviously connected with the calls for liberty from serfdom and greater access to the resources of the land. This hope for all things in common is probably to be connected with rebel demands presented in one account of the meeting between Wat Tyler and Richard II, and the demand that all game, whether in waters or in parks and woods, should become common to all, so that everywhere in the realm, in rivers and fish ponds and woods and forests, they might take the wild beasts and hunt the hare in the fields and do many other such things without restraint. In the bloody aftermath of the meeting between Tyler and the king, Ball too would be killed. Ball was captured in Coventry, tried in St Albans in mid-July, and hanged, drawn and quartered, with his 4 parts sent to 4 cities. St Albans itself witnessed some significant unrest in the summer of 1381. Local challenges to the dominant role of the monastery shaped the St Albans Uprising. Aspirational townsfolk continued their battle to gain greater privileges while drawing on wider regional discontent with the monastery's power. While hardly timid, the rebellion did not involve the same levels of violence as happened elsewhere in England. There were, for instance, no executions of monks, the abbot, or the prior. The leader of the St Albans uprising was a man called William Grindecobbe. We know little about his life, but what we do know is of importance for understanding his motivations and role as a leader. Grindecobbe was educated at the monastery and appears to have had relatives there. He was later involved in a land dispute with the monastery. He had 1 acre confiscated by the monastic authorities. But he also attacked 2 monks who came to measure and claim the land for the monastery. This deed appears to have led to his excommunication, and he was forced to undergo penance naked. By the summer of 1381, Grindecobbe and the St Albans rebels were connected with the wider national uprisings. On the 14th of June, Grindecobbe led a group to London. Rebels were said to have offered their loyalty to the king, but also to their cause before the mysterious leader in the London Revolt, Jack Straw. From the story of the visits to London, we learn further about the rebels' aspirations and their concerns about life under the monastery's dominance. They wanted new boundaries around the town and freedom from the monastic monopolies, thereby allowing them to pasture their animals, obtain fishing rights in certain places with impunity, have rights of hunting and fowling again in certain places, and erect hand mills that they could use freely wherever they wished. Some rebels also sought the support of Wat Tyler. In Tyler, some rebels saw the future of the realm following the expected destruction of the existing legal system. Presumably, rebels were aware of the violent threat Tyler's name could carry in any future negotiations in St Albans. Other rebels sought the direct support of the king and expected that an official letter would convince the abbot of their cause and secure the restoration of their lost liberties. Both options were accepted, and Grindecobbe took on a leading role in approaching the king and Tyler. He apparently knelt 6 times before the king and left his associate Richard Wallingford to secure the king's approval. Grindecobbe and the baker William Caddington arrived back in St Albans ahead of the other rebels and declared their new liberties. Rebels from the area immediately targeted the boundaries or restrictions imposed in local woods, such as folds and gates. The next day, 15th of June, similar activities continued while the St Albans townsfolk discussed how they might consolidate their position. They proposed that all townsfolk capable of bearing arms should help form a military presence, and they were assisted by local peasants and surrounding villages. Demands for access to rabbit trapping seem to have been partly behind the gesture of capturing a live rabbit and fixing it high for the town to see, a symbol of their freedom and authority. They had the prison opened, with prisoners ordered to swear allegiance to the Commons on pain of death. One released prisoner was beheaded. Accompanied by loud shouting, the prisoner's head was fixed on top of the pillory, signalling the advent of the new lawmakers of St Albans. Richard Wallingford returned to St Albans bearing both the King's approval and the authority of the Commons. Faced with Wallingford's delegation, the abbot read the letter, which explained the rights returned to the townsfolk concerning the commons, pasture and fishing, among other things. Wallingford informed the sceptical abbot that the world had changed and that the commons now controlled the legal system. The abbot conceded some demands. What choice did he have? And people were released from inherited obligations to the monastery with the agreement that new charters would be drawn up. As was typical of the 1381 uprising, the rebels burnt bonds, deeds and legal documentation in the marketplace. The rebels wanted more and demanded access to an ancient town charter from the time of King Offa and the founding of the monastery in 793. The abbot claimed he did not know of this charter, but if only to buy time and pacify the rebels, he promised to try and track it down. Some rebels had got into the cloister and lifted up the millstones that the monastery had used as paving stones following a previous victory over the St Albans locals. The millstones were brought to the commons and smashed up. The rebels further announced that if the abbot, prior or monks owed anyone any money, then this should be reclaimed. The burgesses would ensure that the people were reimbursed from the monastery coffers. This offer seems to have been unsurprisingly popular. On the Sunday, news of Tyler's death had reached the rebels. The king also issued a proclamation of peace and a charter of protection for the abbot, the monastery and the monastery property. The townsfolk, backed by popular support in the region, pushed their demands, but now in a more conciliatory manner. The abbot was able to meet the rebel demands for the time being, allowing the use of handmills outside the monastery and accepted freedoms for the townsfolk. Boundaries once achieved by their ancestors decades earlier were, for now, restored, and townsfolk marked the occasion with a celebratory perambulation. When Richard II finally turned his attention to St Albans, a local knight feared destruction should the king intervene. He convinced the king and council that he would instead resolve the situation. On Friday the 28th of June, rebels heard that an army would arrive the next day. This news panicked some of the rebels, but the authoritative Grindecobbe calmed them, allegedly claiming,
"Be sensible men, for we are wealthy. We shall not lack help as long as we are not without our money. Look, the towns surrounding us are our allies, and they will help us if there is need. Let us go out tomorrow morning like men, and meet the knight on our horses outside the town, and let us ask him, before he comes near the town, whether he comes in peace. If he does not, we shall pound him and chase him from our town."
The idea of argument and diplomacy backed by an implicit threat of violence seems typical of Grindecobbe and the rebels. The knight was given a cordial and honourable welcome on the 29th of June, even if the threat of force from both sides kept the peace. Locals were summoned before the knight, who explained the situation to a warm reception. The knight asked for the leading figures to be handed over and tried before a jury of 12 locals. But they replied that they would not accuse anyone because all were good men and loyal to the king, and they knew of no other amongst them who was disloyal. To resolve the situation, Grindecobbe and others were arrested and imprisoned. Grindecobbe was released on bail, Terms were suggested that the townsmen must either satisfy the abbot by restoring the charters, or Grindecobbe would be executed on return to prison. Grindecobbe, for his part, knew his martyrdom was near.
Fellow citizens, whom a breath of freedom has now for a time relieved from long oppression, stand fast now, while you can, and do not be afraid of any punishment I may suffer. If I am to die in the cause of the freedom we won, if I am to die now, then I shall consider myself fortunate to be able to end my life by such martyrdom. Act at this time as you would have been obliged to act if I had been executed yesterday at Hertford. In fact, there was nothing that would have prevented me from seeing the end of my life, had not the abbot recalled his esquires so timely. Indeed, they had charged me with many offences, and had a judge who was favourable to their cause, and eager for my blood.
Grindecobbe's speech emboldened the rebels to defend their newly won liberties, while he was taken back to prison where he awaited trial. On the 13th of July, orders were given for Grindecobbe and others to be brought from prison. Through no small cunning, the justiciar ensured that the judicial process worked for him. While some were imprisoned and later pardoned, Grindecobbe was found guilty of disturbing the king's peace. He was among 15 men who were drawn and hanged. They were dragged across the same fields and executed in the same woods to which they had made claim. When their corpses were hanging, one sympathiser managed to release the bodies so that they could be buried, but townsfolk were forced to put them back. It was not until September 1382 that the remains were allowed to be buried. What we know of the St Albans rebels points to a softer version of the more violent millenarian theology of John Wrawe. Echoing biblical injunctions not to defraud workers and the poor of money owned, Grindecobbe accused the abbot, the prior and some monks of oppression of the commons and of withholding the pay of poor men and labourers. The St Albans rebels intimidated the abbot with reference to the extended eschatological or apocalyptic discourse in the Gospels. They threatened to kill the monks and burn and destroy their buildings, so that no stone in it would be left standing upon another. A direct reference to Jesus' prediction of the destruction of the Jerusalem temple in Matthew 24 and Mark 13. The story might have been invented by the chronicler for dramatic effect and to discredit the rebels, who he wanted to show as almost senselessly violent. However, this story only carries a conditional threat, which is typical of the St Albans revolt. The chronicler used what he found or heard and accordingly tried to make his propagandist point as best he could. Baker as an occupation or name is common among the legal record concerning the uprising. In this respect, we recall that on return to St Albans from London, Grindecobbe was accompanied by William Caddington, a man identified by his occupation, baker. The theological connotations were, presumably, not lost, at least on some of the St Albans rebels in their dispute with the monastery over the millstones. After liberating the millstones from the monastery, bringing them to the commons and smashing them, the rebels were said to have taken the symbolism further still. According to the chronicler at least, the rebels celebrated their victory by distributing the smashed stones to the people, supposedly in the manner of bread distributed after the Mass. As with elsewhere in the uprising, these tendencies in St Albans were seen as pointing to a new England. When Wallingford returned to St Albans as Grindecobbe's envoy to the king, he placed down a standard or pennant of St George. The king's letter commanded the release of charters to the townsfolk concerning common land, pasture, fishery and other possessions. Here again we see the principle of all things in common in England, now at St Albans, and this seems to have been put into practice when rebels made available the popular offer of compensation from the abbot and the monks. East Anglia witnessed some of the most extensive violence in the 1381 uprising. The chronicler Thomas Walsingham put it in apocalyptic terms.
God sent the wrath of his indignation into parts of Suffolk and Norfolk, the harbingers of distress, through the agency of bad angels, certain men more dangerous than the rebels from Essex, themselves angels of Satan, to influence people who were living in peace, people who were harmless, to engage in disturbances like those already described, and to turn the hearts of serfs against their masters.
There were material and ideological interests underpinning the violence that were typical of the uprisings elsewhere. As with the St Albans uprising, there was a dispute over the power of the monastery, in this case in Bury St Edmunds. In Suffolk generally, there are attacks on individuals associated with socio-economic injustices and aggressive implementation of taxation. Frustrations over social aspiration caused by both local lordship and national taxation gave the uprising a degree of coherency beyond local communities. In Suffolk, John Wrawe was the most prominent representative from the lower clergy, and the most prominent leader in the regional uprising, with his reputation stretching beyond the county. The chronicler described Wrawe as a treacherous commoner and an infamous priest who thrived as a rebel leader. Beyond his emergence as a rebel chaplain in 1381, we know little about Wrawe's background. There is even some confusion about the identity of Wrawe, or rather there may be more than one insurgent by the same name in Suffolk. John Wrawe of Sudbury is typically associated with the leader of the rebels active around Sudbury, Mildenhall and Bury St Edmunds. However, one list refers to John Wrawe chaplain, but also John Wrawe, late parson of the church in Ringsfield. John Wrawe of Ringsfield was associated with the violence in the northeast of the county. Were there two John Wrawes, or did both of these John Wrawes refer to the same person? Both options are possible. A related possibility is that the name John Wrawe was used by the parson of Ringsfield as an alias in homage to the different chaplain of Sudbury, something that seems to be attested elsewhere with reference to Wrawe's reputation. Wrawe, or the Wrawes, seem to have had no reservation about using violence or engaging in extortion. Unlike other leaders with comparable backgrounds, such as John Ball, Wrawe is consistently presented in the chronicle and legal record as revelling in plunder for plunder's sake, rather than having a thought-out millenarian or socio-political agenda. However, we cannot easily disassociate him from such agendas. The role of intimidation, violence and extortion was common enough in the revolt, and an integral feature of the denunciations of those deemed to have been exploiters. Even hostile sources noted that Wrawe and his sizable following attacked familiar targets such as the homes and estates of magnates and lawyers. While we do not get obvious biblical interpretation and allusions with Wrawe, it remains that Wrawe was a clergyman. A rebel of his profession knew that his attacks on hated landowners and powerful figures could be understood in biblical and theological terms. As with the uprising elsewhere, Wrawe's popular appeal likely involved the implicit hope of a transformed society, and appealed to the idea of a just king. Hopes partially buried beneath hostile sources or ones concerned with official legal procedure and therefore uninterested in his theological motivations. Wrawe should be seen as a blunt instrument of the revolt, violently implementing the wider aims of social transformation. Ball even seems to have entertained some kind of messianism. Beneath the king and beneath the new roles for figures like Ball, Tyler and Straw, there seems to have been ideas of local or regional leadership. Paralleling the presentation of Ball's preeminent position as spiritual leader of the realm in relation to the king, Wrawe was said to have taken on the priestly crown alongside the kingly crown of the second most notorious rebel of the Suffolk Uprising, Robert Westbrook. Because Wrawe was a priest, he apparently refused to put one crown upon another, and so left the other to Westbrook. This relationship then copied or mimicked at county level the notions of rulership at national level, while echoing biblical notions of distinct traditions of kingly and priestly messiahship. There seems to have been another East Anglian example, Geoffrey Lister, as the King of the Commons in Norfolk. If the chronicler is to be believed, this dire-come king even made knights act as his bodyguards and cut up and taste his food before kneeling in front of their new king when he ate. Anyway, the account of the activities of the Wrawe around the Essex-Suffolk border is clearer from the 2nd of June onwards. Wrawe and his followers from Essex, Hertford, Suffolk and Norfolk caused much destruction, at least of selected targets. On the 13th of June, the rebel band arrived in Cavendish and acquired the keys for the parish church, taking stashed away valuables. The valuables belonged to the target of rebel ire, the unpopular Sir John Cavendish, again likely a deliberate target. Wrawe's band then moved on to Melford Green, where they treated themselves to a pipe of red wine in a tavern, using the accumulated resources as a pledge. He paid for the tab with his own money, or so Wrawe claimed later. On the evening of the feast of Corpus Christi, the band continued to Bury St Edmunds. Wrawe raised a cry summoning the men of the town to the south gate, threatening death for those who opposed. As with the rebels timing their entry into London, Wrawe's entry into Bury at the festival of Corpus Christi would have been understood, by some at least, to have held some social and theological significance relating to the Eucharist, sacrifice, and liberation for those under the bondage of masters, lords, and senior clergy. On the 14th of June, Wrawe and others attacked and looted buildings belonging to the prior of the monastery, Sir John Cambridge. Wrawe also commanded the prison in the town of Bury St Edmunds to be opened and the inmates released. We also see how Wrawe's name and reputation could provoke fear. Wrawe's associates, including more clergy, headed to Thetford across the Norfolk border. There, they extorted payment from the mayor and leading burgesses, using the threat of Wrawe coming to destroy the town. Wrawe's name seems to have terrified people. Indeed, one knight extorted money by threatening to bring Wrawe and his band in, allegedly without Wrawe's blessing, but he nevertheless gave Wrawe his cut. Meanwhile, John Cavendish was captured and beheaded by rebels apparently associated with Wrawe's band, who placed his head on the pillory in Bury Market Square. According to one indictment, Cavendish would have escaped by boat had he not been thwarted by Katerina Gayman of Lakenheath, who freed the boat into the river before Cavendish could get onto it. Around Lakenheath in the preceding decade, Cavendish had been a commissioner sent by the Crown to deal with assaults on officials following disputes over taxation and punishments. His aggressive deeds were evidently remembered by the locals. John Cambridge, prior of the monastery, had fled Bury St Edmunds but was captured and beheaded by Wrawe's rebels after his guide betrayed him. These rebels took their prisoner to Mildenhall and met with a large group of rebels, perhaps Wrawe's band. At Mildenhall Heath, the prior was sentenced to death by beheading. With his body stripped, the prior was left unburied for 5 days in an open field. The perpetrators, with Wrawe and his followers, headed back to Bury triumphant. The prior's head was placed high on the end of a lance for the Bury townsfolk to see. The rebels then reenacted the friendship between the prior and John Cavendish by bringing their heads together, first as if they were whispering to each other, then as though kissing, before placing their heads on the pillory. As happened elsewhere in the uprising, playful, carnivalesque imagery and performance were carried out somewhat literally and with deadly consequences. Wrawe's band were drawn into a long-running monastery versus town dispute. After the execution of the prior, the rebels entered the cloisters looking for selected targets, and carried out more execution. The rebels told the now gathered monks that once they had lorded it over the burgesses of Bury, but now things would be shown to have changed. An ancient legal precedent was sought, the Charters of Liberties granted by King Canute, the founder of the monastery. The monks brought out various materials that might help or potentially incriminate rebels. Valuables were also handed over to the rebels, and were to be returned to the monks on condition that the appropriate candidate be appointed abbot, who would confirm the Charters of Liberty for the townsfolk. It was not until the 23rd of June that the authorities took back control of Bury. The Earl of Suffolk, leading 500 men, arrived in the area after being sent by the king, with pleas and punishments soon to follow. Meanwhile, in the preceding week, Wrawe of Ringsfield was rampaging violently in north-east Suffolk. His band were also involved in the attack on Mettingham Castle, resulting in a haul of riches for the rebels, though charters and legal documents were, as ever, a target for the rebels. The game was soon up for Wrawe, or Wrawe of Sudbury at least, and an example was made of him. By the 10th of July he was confessing criminal and traitorous activities before the sheriffs and coroner of London, perhaps under torture. He was sent to the Tower, and in May 1382 Wrawe was sentenced to death, where he would be drawn, disembowelled, hanged and beheaded. For further discussion and reading on the millenarianism of the 1381 uprising, go to CenSAMM's open access critical dictionary of apocalyptic and millenarian movements at CDAM.org, which includes entries on John Ball, William Grindecobbe and John Wrawe, as well as numerous articles relating to concepts of millenarianism and apocalypticism.